Well, thanks everyone for being part of our Sunday call for the People-Centered Internet. We're delighted to have Jon Iwata with us as our guest speaker. And I want to thank Schneider Alfonso for subbing today for Casey Komlowski, who is happily vacationing somewhere in a wooded setting right now on the West Coast. So good for her. So I've known Jon for a long time, right? And he's a dynamo, right? The going back to his early career, one of the first things that he made a mark is he was one of the only people that I know in IBM in the profession that he was coming up through that has a technical patent, right? And so good for you, Jon, right? We're clearly making intellectual property contributions before it was fashionable. And then he kind of remade and kicked the organization at IBM, kicking and screaming into real marketing credentials, all right, which were, it was some feat because we used to call marketing people, they were salespeople, right? So we were confusing people with our terminology, and Jon got it all straightened out. In any event, today he's at Yale University. He's going to talk about stakeholder capitalism. He's the chairman of the board of trustees at Cooper Hewitt, which is a Smithsonian institution. This is the design, right, museum. And he's held a lot of other roles. I simply say that we're very fortunate to have him with us, and Yale is very fortunate to have him as part of their, faculty, as part of their team that created stakeholder capitalism. We're looking forward to hearing about it today, Jon. So it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. It's wonderful to see you and to see some old friends and colleagues. Delightful. It's been quite a while since I've seen some of you. So it's a joy and a pleasure. Yeah, in my so-called retirement, like maybe for some of you or all of you, I actually did not have a plan to do anything other than to take a breath and to consider what to do next. But I had gotten to know some marketing faculty at Yale School of Management while I was at IBM. And when they heard that I was retiring in 2018, 2019, one of the faculty members asked me if I was interested in spending more time at Yale. And I said, well, like doing what? And he says, we'll figure it out. And it turned out to be a executive in residency, executive fellow appointment. And for the first year or so, it was very loosely defined. I would go up to Yale and they posted office hours for me. I didn't know what that was about, but you had, the graduate students sign up and they just wanted to talk about career stuff or IBM stuff or being an Asian business person or et cetera, just anything they wanted. It was just wonderful. But about 2019, 2020, my colleague Ravi asked him, hey, are you enjoying this? I said, I love it, just love it. And he said, would you like to do something more, like take on a research project? And I said, I absolutely would. And that was because at about that time, 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic, CEOs, mostly in the United States, but also elsewhere, were beginning to make a big noise about stakeholder capitalism. ESG was beginning to enter the vocabulary. There were other terminology around conscious capitalism and Davos. Everyone's talking about this, and I said I would like to look into this from a practitioner standpoint, because that's clearly my background is being in business. I'd like to look at this topic through the perspective of the how of it, because I understand. I think I understand the reason for it, and I certainly know the messaging that's flowing out of companies and CEOs' mouths about creating value for society, creating value for employees and others, not just the shareholder. So I got support to do that. What I'd like to do today is to share with you the learnings from this work that began back in 2020-ish, and where we are today. And of course, mostly I'd love to have a dialogue with you. So as always, please speak up or put in the chat if you have any comments or observations or questions as we go along this morning. Let me do a screen share here. Hopefully you can see that. Yes? Good. I guess we'll start here. People tend to point their fingers at Milton Friedman. His famous essay in the New York Times from more than 50 years ago is worth reading in its entirety. He is often, I would say, misconstrued. And even in this excerpt, people don't pay attention to some of the nuances of what he said here. Nonetheless, he does certainly say and did advocate that if you are management, if you are a CEO, if you're management, you work for the owners, you do what they want you to do, and generally speaking, they want you to maximize profit for them. He notes here, stay within the rules of the game, and so forth. And later in the essay or elsewhere in the essay, he does acknowledge that it is possible that owners, that is the shareholder, may want you to do something other than to maximize profit, but nonetheless, this is the core of his argument. And he's often credited or blamed for triggering or unleashing this multi-decade era where mostly US CEOs optimized business decisions to maximize shareholder value, meaning profits, but also share buybacks and all sorts of things. Now, as I mentioned, many people point to the Business Roundtable, which is, as you may know, mostly an association of large US headquartered enterprises, including IBM, JP Morgan Chase, and Johnson & Johnson, as you see here. And they famously, 2019, revised their statement of the corporation, the purpose of the corporation, to reflect stakeholder value creation in service of shareholder value creation. And then, as I said, Davos and books have been written, and then ESG and climate change and DE&I and pandemic and George Floyd's murder, all of these things began to converge around the same time period. Typical headlines of 2020, the general feeling, if you recall those days, part of this was in reaction to Donald Trump in the White House, tweeting and making statements and doing things around immigration and a whole host of things, climate change. And companies were being called on, and I'll talk about, from whom, to speak out, take positions on a whole range of issues, and they certainly did. Now, if you fast forward to today, and I could update this chart, almost daily. The atmosphere has changed quite a bit. If you think about 2020, making statements, we stand with, we support various issues and causes. Today, there are repercussions to speaking out, taking positions on, committing to changing policies. And you can sort of read through these headlines. I'm sure you're familiar with the controversy. And you could, as a CEO, be attacked from the left and the right for doing anything or not doing enough. And in my conversations with CEOs, and I'll describe, it really has shifted to some degree, at least the public declaration or the public communication of various positions. And this is a part of the dynamic as it's playing out right now. So when Yale invited me to, or supported me looking into this space, I started to interview CEOs and some CxOs and board chairs. And I started with people I knew, and they introduced me to others. Now, I must say that one of the very few benefits of the pandemic was that CEOs weren't on their airplanes. They were home like the rest of us. sitting in front of their computers. They had time. I was able to interview a lot of CEOs in 2020 and 2021. I don't think I could possibly do that today. So it turned out to be, a benefit, as I said. You can glance through these names and companies. So a few things that are obvious here. These are mostly U.S. These are mostly large established enterprises. And so with all of that in mind, as we kind of go through the learnings here, factor that in. I continue to interview. I'm trying to interview more non-US and more, startups. Some of them are in here. So by the way, a request to all of you, if you have connections with leaders of corporations, as well as not-for-profits, people in civil society, I'm eager to continue to talk to them. At a very high level, the why, I must say that by and large, the CEOs do not think of this whole space as a moral imperative. Some do. If you're familiar with Hubert Joly, who turned around Best Buy, now at Harvard, wrote a nice book about the heart of business. He is an advocate for this being a moral imperative, and also very much being a personal North Star. And he's on this drive out of Harvard to convince future leaders and current leaders to make it their own purpose. And there are some CEOs I spoke with who also said this is a moral imperative, and this is why businesses must do that. But I must say, out of 135 or so interviews to date, it's like single digits. Most of the CEOs would view this as maybe personally they see it as a moral imperative, but by and large, they think of this as a new competitive reality, just simply a new environment in which business must compete. And parenthetically, I think this is quote a good thing because, as many of the CEOs said, if it's a personal thing, that can come and go with the leader or the leadership team. But if it's a new reality, then it doesn't matter how you feel about it. It's something you must respond to. Now, if I go a little deeper here, I think the number one thing that the CEOs point to is a generational shift. Some talk about, existential threat to the planet, huge societal inequities and so forth. But by and large, the big driver of the why would be this generational shift simultaneously of the people they need to attract and retain as employees. I would say this is the number one stakeholder that they absolutely mention first. How do I get and attract the talent? The same people, the new generation, are also the customer. Although I would hasten to add here that many of the CEOs I spoke with would say that if you ask consumers if they care about the values and social impact of the companies that they do business with, they'll say, I absolutely care. But their behavior would suggest otherwise, that their behavior as consumers is they still want good product, good service, good price, all those things. The difference might be, ironically, B2B customers, and we could talk about that if you'd like. Citizens too, that if you ask the same generation of people, they do care about what business does here. About the Edelman Trust Barometer and how there's just generally more trust in business today than other institutions. And you see a big shift in the profile of the investor. Of course, the big institutional firms, BlackRock and so forth, shifting a lot of their lenses of investment toward ESG. And again, that is full of controversy today and pushback. The thing that fascinated my faculty colleagues at Yale, was this quote from Satya Nadella of Microsoft. This is back in 2019 again, that same period. Keep coming back to this. You can read it for yourself here. What was the thing that was not only the biggest thing, but it was something that he felt he had no preparation for it. Now, if you're faculty at a business school, or frankly, your Microsoft HR, in leadership development, and you read this from one of the most prominent CEOs in business today, that's quite a thing, isn't it? Like no preparation whatsoever. And so there was a lot of faculty interest to say, well, what's the best way, or what are some ways that business schools and HR functions and corporations, what can be done to prepare leaders, not just for the CEO role, but on their way up into positions of responsibility, so that they understand this multi-constituent world, or multi-stakeholder world. And this has been really driving a lot of our work. So, rather happily and somewhat surprisingly, some of the CEOs stayed in contact with me as we're kind of going through this research, and said, what have you learned? What are you going to do with this work? It's interesting. And some of them said, you ought to get support from the school to create a program, which is Yale speak for like a center or an institute. And again, some of these CEOs like Sam Palmisano, former IBM CEO, and Ken Chenault, former IBM director and former American Express CEO, and Lou Gerstner and Lisa Su, now a fabulous job at AMD, many of you know her, and others, supported the creation of this program, not only with resources, but also their own time and attention. So the individuals I mentioned and a few others formed the advisory board. And last November, we established formally this program at Yale. You see our mission here. We really do want to address that need of preparing leaders for these new realities. There's a huge debate in this space, as you would expect, and as appropriate, and as I've learned. Even the academics, have a very serious critique of this idea of stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder value maximization. After a lot of nice academic, rigorous debate with faculty at Yale, I think we at least are unified around our premise here that you can read this, that this is a way. This is not about ignoring shareholder value. It's not even about minimizing the importance of shareholder value creation if you're a for-profit entity. It's a how do you do that? And the view here, again, not without controversy, is that ultimately the interests of shareholders and stakeholders do align in the long term, which of course is hugely important. And it actually allows you to find new ways of creating value, which I'll illustrate and talk about, which is why in the name of our program, we have Stakeholder Innovation. And I'll talk about that. The last point here on this chart is really important here. The way to measure and manage financial value creation, economic value creation is not only well established, it's universally accepted, and it's been around for a long time. Non-economic, non-financial measures and practices are still emergent. So a lot of the CEOs felt that this isn't the only thing that's missing, but it is, and it makes it difficult. It also opens up companies to charges of greenwashing and purpose washing and so forth, and I'll give you some examples of that. So there are three key learnings here, and this one may not surprise some of you. It did surprise me to some degree. I did not ask about purpose and values or mission and principles, but so many CEOs brought it up, immediately. Like what did you wish you knew on your way up to the C-suite, and what are you doing to deal with these stakeholder issues and so forth? And they start talking about the purpose of the company and the value system. And how important it is to get these into place. And as you see here in this chart, but it isn't the articulation or the definition or the communication of the purpose and values. It is the hard work of aligning them and integrating them into the actual operations of the company. You can see some of the quotes here. These are all Chatham House rule kind of interviews, which is why you don't see the attribution here. And I found this to be encouraging, that they didn't just talk about the communication of a noble purpose and an inspiring mission and things like that. They said that, that yes, you got to do that, but as you can see here, is you got to do all the other hard work there. Well, it's interesting that in talking to these CEOs, like, when did you find that you needed to revisit, revise, reaffirm, or create your purpose and values? And I call them at founding and refounding moments. Clearly, a founding moment is like Warby Parker. I talked to Neil Blumenthal of Warby Parker, and like a lot of entrepreneurs, they didn't have to write anything down at first because they just talked to each other. They made all the hiring decisions and they made a lot of the resource allocation decisions. But of course, as they grew and other people were making these decisions, they found it necessary to codify what they stood for, but also codify values, or in other words, their culture. Like, how are we going to work together? How are we going to make decisions? But also startups are, our dear, what a name, but anyway, GTS, the big mass spin out of IBM, services business, talked to Martin Schroeder a couple of times. And, I think they're like 90,000 employees, but they're like a startup, right? They have no brand, they have no culture. And like, who are we? What does the world need us? What is our differentiation? And also, what kind of culture do we want? And in Martin's case, a lot of former IBMers on this call, Martin said, we did not want a lot of IBM DNA. We wanted some, but we didn't deliberately wanted a different culture. So common here. Margaret Keane of Synchrony being spun out of GE Capital, a founding moment. By the way, if you have a large piece of the company depart, the remaining company is going through a refounding moment because a lot of their business and identity and culture goes with them. So you have almost simultaneously, you see here this kind of same work being done by the management teams. But by and large, I don't think I talked to, except for one, that would be Ken Frazier of Merck. Every CEO felt that they were leading a transformation. Disruption, and it wasn't pandemic, although it was playing out there. It was still this kind of digital disruption, and now here comes AI and all these different things. And these are like refounding moments. So Mary Barra, classic, like, who are we? Are we a automobile company? Are we a mobility company? And that's one of those repositioning of our purpose values to all stakeholders. Investors think we're dead. They want to put their money into Tesla. We got to reposition to the investor. People don't want to work here. We need to attract, software engineers and data scientists and designers. They all want to work for, Spotify. They don't want to work for GM. We got to reposition for that stakeholder, that stakeholder, that stakeholder. So this kind of CEO agenda around transformation, very common. And the playbook, very similar. I think a lot of you know this, especially if you're familiar with IBM. Whether we wrote down our purpose or not, we had a real sense of what we do, why we exist, and what makes your company different and needed and unique. And then values or principles, is the how we're going to work around here. And there's this kind of common scaffolding inside of companies. And I must say that this isn't, as many of the CEOs, I think all of the CEOs said, this isn't taught at business school. It may be an elective or it's like books, but it's not like, no, this is like real management science stuff. And they were like, wow, I go, well, like Martin Schroeder, how did you even know to do this? I got the job and I started calling CEOs I respect. And they said, you got to do this. And he took notes. Now, this part of it is, again, the hard work, which is the alignment into the management system. It's not on the chart, but I would say, I would ask the CEOs, companies have scores of business processes and aspects of operations. If you were to advise the next CEO or a colleague about the right side of this chart, which is to integrate and align this purpose and values into the management system, what would you say they needed to, prioritize? And it's the same list: human capital criteria, like, who do you hire, who do you put into leadership roles? Does it matter how they achieve their results, or does it just matter? All these things need to be codified and built into human capital systems. Second, closely related, is performance management. How do you set targets for businesses? How do you set targets for leaders? How do you pay people? How do you hold them accountable? Does it really matter? And the third is resource allocation. So when push comes to shove, are we going to take that capital and put it into the pay plan for living wage? Are we going to put it into supply chain for sustainability? Where are we going to put our money? That's resource allocation. And of course, measurement and metrics for accountability and measuring, return on these investments are all part of that system. And that's why the last bullet on the far right here is important, because now you're talking about some non-financial things like, okay, we're going to put money into into HR in the hope that skills and training, or better wages, or better benefit, whatever it is going to show up in things like retention and better customer service and higher engagement and things like that. And that's how the CEO thinks about this in total. So purpose and values provide that North Star for stakeholders, but that it is not a soft thing. It is about promising value to employees and investors and the others based on your self-definition. And because it has to be real, then it's not enough to just do the communication part of it, which is very popular. And I'm seeing a comment here from Mike. One of the most fascinating conversations I've participated in. Yes. Yep. Right. Wasn't that a question? I mean, I don't know if Mike Wing is on the call here, but we said, what kind of? I still remember this, Mike. You really shouldn't ask 100,000 or 300,000 IBMers what should the values of IBM be, because you're going to get their head's going to go into trying to write value statements. We should ask them other questions that will trigger it, and that question was tremendous. And was so helpful. And by the way, I continue to point to Values Jam as one way, not the only way, but one way that a company can either create its values or reaffirm them.
John, I'm not sure that everyone on the call knows what Values Jam is. So if you could just provide a little bit of context for your last comments.
Sure. So when Lou Gerstner famously turned the company around, IBM around in the 90s from its near-death experience, and did a lot more than that. And when he retired and tossed the keys to Sam Palmisano, Sam literally told me, now I'm working for Sam, not to Lou, is the only way Sam can. You gave Lou this fabulous send-off. He's a legend, but you made it much for me, because now everybody thinks IBM is completely fixed. But we've got a lot of transformation to drive here, and I don't have a burning platform. I don't have a reason to change that Lou had. So what are we going to do? And that was the strategic reason for it. So Values Jam was, so we know what IBM isn't anymore, and we know IBM is back, but who are we? We're a very different company. And Sam, to his credit, said, look, I don't want to just sit in a room and write those things or hire a consultant or so forth. So Mike Wing and others were very instrumental here to say, we have this intranet thing, and why don't we use it not for one-way communication, but let's have a massive conversation with the entire workforce about what IBM's values should be. And that was the first kind of company-wide jam. Think of it as like a social network moment inside of IBM back in the 90s. And we had few questions to trigger these conversations with IBMers to each other, not with management, but just to sort of co-create these and to use more modern language. And Mike recalls one of the top questions we asked that got tremendous comments that we then had to, you could imagine, I think it was 72 hours all global. We then had to spend months analyzing the responses. And out of that came IBM's 3 values. If you see the values today, I think they're the same. You're not going to find them, I think, extraordinarily different from maybe other companies. There's a little, peculiar language in there. But what was powerful about this was the fact that it was co-created with the entire workforce. And it didn't stop there, because going back to Sam's request, it became a platform for change management. The logic is very clear here. So if you're going to ask employees, like, what should our values be, or what do we actually value? And one of them is, innovation that matters for our company and for the world. I think that was one of them. Great, feels good. Right behind values jam, we took a gap analysis survey where we asked employees, so those are our values. Is that what you experience in your part of IBM every day? And as you would imagine, there's gaps, right? But we were able then to say, well, what impedes your ability to live that particular value? Let's say it's innovation. And they might say, lack of IT tools, conflicting and misaligned incentives, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had an analytical way to identify these gaps and then to, progressively attack those. And so from a CEO perspective, he got his transformation agenda, but it came not from a, burning platform or something, nor through corporate edict. It came from the workforce.
Jon, thanks for unpacking that, my friend.
Yeah, I shouldn't take that for granted, Kevin. Thank you. And that was question from Mike. What does the concept of stakeholder capitalism tell companies about how they should collect and manage data about their customers' employees? Which companies are doing that critical task right? There are 2 ways to answer that, Mike. One is, how do you know, first of all, identify your stakeholders, prioritize your stakeholders, and then the most important piece of that is understand your stakeholders. Like, what do they expect? What do they want, whether they're articulated or not? And here you find a very uneven set of answers. I think most companies would have a pretty refined capability to understand their customers and consumers, but that is usually limited to product service, right? You don't find companies understanding their customer or consumer around issues, climate or DE&I or what have you. And so that part of it is, while existing and probably refined to get a lot of data here, it's incomplete. You can imagine, as you go around, investors, we all have investor relations capability, but do we understand the investor along these other dimensions? Employee data, companies are sitting on it. They have a lot of employee data, but again, it's not fully dimensional around the range of issues that companies now are paying attention to. The second way I would answer that, so one is understanding your stakeholders with some kind of precision, and the other is data for the non-financial, non-economic measures of value, like greenhouse gas emissions, or plastics and packaging, or sustainability of the supply chain. Social impact. Now, if you look at this example I have on the screen here, we're doing a case study on Mars, the privately owned company. It's bigger than Coca-Cola. They do more than candy. Huge pet health, pet care, pet food, and other areas. And for the first time in their history, the family, namely the shareholders, for various reasons, felt compelled to codify the shareholders' expectations or objectives for management. And they went through this big process here. And you notice here on the left side of the chart, they have this thing called compass. And the lower right of that circle is positive societal impact. Well, what data are you going to rely on to measure that? And it's squishy. It's squishy because they have greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. They have a plastic commitment. And in the lower left, they have trusted partner. What data do you have to measure, that other than attitudinal stuff? So I think, Mike, the data standpoint is still one of those things that, is emergent for those couple of dimensions. Key learning number 2 here is it comes up all the time with CEOs, and it's like, on what basis do we decide what issues matter to our company and to our stakeholders, because the process is not satisfactory. So I asked them today, well, how do you do it today? And with the exception of a very few number of CEOs, they all say it's not a good way. I, the CEO, decide, which of course is subject to the vagaries and prejudices and the personal interests of the CEO. Number 2, we wait, and something blows up out in society, and we kind of monitor it, and then nobody feels about that because it feels like we're being calculating or we're late, and therefore we react to pressure. So they don't like that. And the third one, which might surprise you, is a colleague on the senior management team personally cares about the issue and appeals to the rest of us to support her or him. And I could actually remember this happening at IBM, where you had a person saying, I'm Asian, and we got to do something here around anti-Asian violence, or I'm a woman, or I'm a this, or I'm a that, or my family, or I have a child, or I have a friend, and I need you to support me on this one, and we do. So the CEOs say, none of those are good reasons, or it doesn't have rigor, and there must be a better way. So one of the things we did in response is we have a lot of good interns working on our program. We had them do a scan of what exists, whether they're from companies or third parties, to help companies determine, quote, the materiality of various issues. And I would say that the key learning from all of this was most of these tools and frameworks will help you with risk mitigation and issue management. So these are pretty refined processes to say, we're an insurance company, or we're an oil company or energy company. These are relevant issues that could come bite us. And some of them have very refined scenario planning processes, almost like crisis management drills, right? Like, well, this issue is coming toward us. What do we do if it lands? Do we say something? Do we do something? What kind of evidence set do we have to respond to this? What's missing here, though, is what CEOs are kind of asking for, which is not to play defense, but to play offense. And here we really did a deep dive into Nike. And, Nike famously, with some controversy, of course, has taken very public positions on a range of issues, and it's been heavy blowback, whether it's stock reaction or calls for boycotts or what have you. And they've weathered these things up to now, fairly well. And you sort of get inside of, like, how do you determine these things? It's based on things that aren't in those other tools. And so we're beginning to create a materiality assessment tool with some lenses here that are mostly absent from the existing tools and frameworks that we ran across. Some might surprise you as being absent, like purpose and values. Is this issue consistent with or aligned with the purpose of our company and our value system? Another one is lower right here, kind of at 5 o'clock, is history. If this issue, if we take an action or not, or if we don't take an action on a given issue, is it consistent or inconsistent with everything that's happened before with our brand. Doesn't matter if we were around. I mean, IBMers will understand this, right? I mean, look what we've done for decades around dimensions of equal opportunity or global issues or what have you. And it's amazing that history or precedent is not a lens in most of the other tools and so forth. So this is an example of a tool-like thing that our program at Yale hopes to refine, do some studies against, and make available to all. Let me look at the chat here. How do companies navigate the all-important values to its many stakeholders and long-term impact of the actions in this political area in which any kind of impact would be wokeism? I'll talk about that. Define its stakeholders would involve things in which, like committees in which the stakeholders. Yes, great question. We've adopted a definition that is, some academics have done a lot of research around, but it's simply a stakeholder is a party, a person, organizations who are important to your success and could be impacted by your business operations, both. And that last part is probably the more controversial one because that gets to what the economists would call externalities. So if we're doing something and it affects the community or some other part of the world or et cetera, then we would identify them as a relevant stakeholder. How can we promote companies to send products in the world that are part of a circular economy that they will accept back when they're, that's a very specific question. I'll set that aside for the moment. B Corps, yeah, I've talked to some CEOs of B Corps. One is as recently as last week. Interestingly, so far, the CEOs of B Corps, I would say, is they were somewhat surprised that their B Corp status doesn't insulate them, if you will, or provide a level of differentiation in making business decisions. In fact, the last CEO was almost like a therapy session with me. He was like, boy, I hope I'm not, his term was I'm jaded because it does come down to making money. If I don't make money, I can't pay my people, above the minimum wage. If I don't make money, I can't invest in, sustainability things. I can't do this. I can't do that. We got to make money. We got to have great products and services. We have to have a great distribution channel. We got to market these things. So I would say that, again, limited in the B Corp leaders I've spoken with, I don't perceive a massive difference in the issues and the challenges that they've at least shared with me. This piece here is, and if you're interested in this, I can actually send this to you. So again, all of that before materiality of an issue. So what do you do once you determine that something is material to your business, to your brand, and to your stakeholders? Is it now I can tweet out a statement that we stand with blank? Well, clearly CEOs say, making statements just exposes you to criticism, starting with your own employees. We've made a statement in support of blank, but what have we actually done? And so we wanted to do a piece of work, which is to look at the range of actions that companies have taken or can take once they determine that a given issue or opportunity is material to their interests or to their stakeholders. So we had cohorts of interns analyze, and they found 50 different examples, and then we classified the actions, as you see here, from donating money to changing products to changing policy and all the rest. The other thing we classified is with whom did you go it alone? Did you activate your ecosystem and your partners? Or did you join or form a coalition? How do you measure this? No measurement to publicly reporting measurement with KPIs. And the last one is like why. So we had the interns reverse engineer the motivation, which was another way of cross-checking the materiality assessment. In other words, Target says they're going to do this. Why? Do they cite their values, their purpose? Do they cite their stakeholders? And we literally made these into 50 cards, and they've proven to be helpful in helping companies open up their minds or inspire them, if you will, about the range of actions they can take that perhaps they had not considered. Finally, and this is probably the centerpiece of I'm most excited about this one, which is, so the question I put to the CEOs is, so when you operate or lead a company at the intersection of these stakeholders, customers want more for less, employees, you've promised employees this kind of experience and compensation and culture. You know what the investors want, society is, got all sorts of problems. Do you end up making trade-offs, or does that lead to something else? And I'm so happy to hear to say that most CEOs say you got to be careful of trade-off thinking. And if you frame the problem differently for your team, it actually leads to different, new thinking. It leads to innovation of different types, but it does not come naturally to us. Well, I'd like to talk about that. So it almost surprises CEOs, like the quote on the left here, that most of the time our organizations try to deliver along what he called one axis. So if your job is marketing and sales, you know what you need to do. HR, you know what you need to do. Supply chain, manufacturing, you know what you need to do. But often these stakeholder issues and opportunities are conjoined. But we don't often ask the team to deliver along a multiple axis or multiple requirements. But when we do, they always seem to deliver. They come up with the ideas. But we do need, as the one on the right suggests, we need a new approach to that. So for those of you who are familiar with design, or even if you're not, you probably recognize the name Eames. Ray and Charles Eames, the husband and wife design team from the last century, famous for the chairs, but they did a lot more than that. IBM did a lot with them. Amazing designers and design legacy. Charles was often asked about, keys or secrets to great design, and he said this on the left, and he drew this on the right. And he wasn't talking about stakeholder capitalism, but he was talking about the need to understand the constraints in detail of any design project, because the constraints define the solution, right? And the drawing on the right does suggest that if you understand the different constraints of stakeholders, it can define the problem in a way that may lead to a really good solution, perhaps solutions you did not consider. In talking to John Donahoe of Nike, I asked him for an example of this, and he said, yeah, there is an example. It's what we're doing to address our carbon issue. And I spent a lot of time with this team that some years ago was tasked to develop their lowest carbon shoe. And what their team shared with me is, if you take your standard user-centered design approach, or human-centered design approach, or design thinking, which you may be familiar with, you're going to focus on what the customer wants, and you understand those pretty well. But if you're setting out to do a low carbon shoe that's a legitimate shoe, you not only have to understand the consumer's constraints for that low carbon shoe. In other words, they still want it to be a great Nike shoe. You have to understand all the other stakeholder constraints. Now, these are not audiences to message, your stories to. These are constraints or requirements that define the problem that you're going to solve with your shoe. And this is highly simplified, but you get I think that the point here, that you can identify these constraints, and many of them are conjoined, which makes it hard. But if you can solve for this combined problem or multi-dimensional problem, you really got something. Wouldn't that be amazing if we could simultaneously solve for low carbon and manufacturable, which makes it profitable, and it's a good shoe, and that could be it. Now, what happened, of course, is it changed. This is like the brief. It changed the team because they just couldn't be, designers like they normally have the design team, which then tosses it over to manufacturing, which then so forth. They had to bring in different kinds of experts. They had to create new kinds of processes, et cetera. But in the end, they introduced a shoe called Space Hippie. And the greatest contribution of state is, well, let me just show you this. You can read these quotes. The greatest contribution of Space Hippie may turn out not to be a new brand that generates, bazillions of dollars for Nike. It's probably the fact that Space Hippie proved to all of Nike that they could use these threads, these fabrics, and these processes to build great shoes. They don't have to be sustainable shoes or low carbon. They can just be Air Jordans or whatever, and they're going to address their carbon footprint problem. And they set out to do all of that. And what's different about these quotes is that they weren't sequential, right? It was simultaneous. And I love the John Donahoe quote in the middle because it's on an earnings call. And he didn't go to Davos and sit on a panel and say this. He said it on an earnings call. And of course, you see the GQ review on the right. This is really hard to do for a company, the simultaneously trying to solve for all the different constraints. So I ran across other examples. This one is probably well known to you around American Express and small business. I sat down with the executive who did this, Susan Sabat. I showed her the Nike example, and we reverse engineered the brief for what became Small Business Saturday, as if she had this brief at the beginning, which she did not. Neither did the Nike team, by the way. And both of them said, I wish they had this, wish we had this kind of tool so that we wouldn't have made so many mistakes, et cetera. Even Nielsen, and some of you know David Kenny, who spent some time at IBM for a while, his example here, which is not intuitive, that he had a core business problem. He's at Nielsen. The core business challenge was around their data set, representative American households media consumption. But he also had a diversity challenge in terms of income inequality with certain parts of his workforce. It turns out these were conjoined problems, and the answer was to redesign work. It wasn't to pay people differently on the one hand or to not be disrupted on the other. It turned out to be to redesign an aspect of how Nielsen actually operates. And that was because David framed the problem as a conjoint problem, not as separate issues to be managed by different parts of his team. So, since we began to see this pattern, of course, reverse engineered, what if we took the learnings and found a willing company to try it out as if they were starting off from the start with this approach? And it turned out to be the Hartford, the insurance company. And we ran a stakeholder design lab with the Hartford to help them address their net zero commitment. And anyway, we tried out some of these prototype tools and approaches, the team configuration and all the rest. And they came up with 3 ideas to help them with their net zero goal. And I debrief with them repeatedly. Would you have come up with these ideas through a standard brainstorming session or ideation session or whatever, a strategic retreat? And they said no. And the difference was the pre-work, the way the brief was framed, the people who were part of this experience were experts from different parts of the company, et cetera. They took these 3 ideas to the CEO, and the CEO approved them for implementation, meaning more work to be done here. But they were in his view, as they shared with me, not the typical ideas that come out of an ideation session, because they had been interrogated through profitability, regulatory environment, et cetera, et cetera. We had a conference on this idea of a stakeholder design earlier this year, and it was productive, I'd say. Let me wrap up here. So we have a good pipeline of case studies that we're working our way through. The cases are around the dimensions of stakeholder management and innovation that I've talked about today with you. You know, case studies have particular weight with faculty and with students and with companies, as you would guess, because they're rigorous and all that stuff, and we're working our way through them. We've begun to integrate some of our learnings and some of the cases into the core curriculum, and we finished doing this for the first time this spring. And I was one of the co-taught this with the 360 first-year MBAs. And they were a skeptical lot, as you would expect and hope them to be. And they didn't just accept a lot of the stuff that we were sharing with them as if it were, truth. So we learned a lot from actually teaching some of this in a real world setting. Let me end with this quote. I'll tell you, it's from Lou Gerstner. Interviewed him on this idea. This is very Lou. You know, he's like, come on, the idea that a great company creates value for employees and customers and society and shareholders, as if that's something new. That's not new. What is new is, in his day, there wasn't social media. In his day, we didn't have this existential threat to the planet. In his day, and he says, this is different. And it does call, as he says here, for some new tools, some new skills, some new approaches, and that's what we're trying to work on. Okay, that's a lot, and would love to hear from you, or observations and further questions and so forth. But that's where we are today.
Fantastic. Now, I just want to point out, everyone, we're at the end of our first full hour, right? So as is our tradition, if you need to jump off at this point, our gratitude for being with us. We're now into our Q&A overtime with Jon. That'll take us to the top of the hour. So thank you very much, Jon, for staying with us and for the questions that you folks are about to share. Maylin, you are not, your hand is up, so you are first. Jump in.
Okay, so I can't be more timely for the people-centered internet. And this is some of the bleeding edge work that we're doing. In the last couple of weeks, people-centered internet has just been approved to lead 3 sprints for the Census Bureau's Innovation Lab, Open Innovation Lab. And this actually was started by somebody from the Nike Foundation when some White House Presidential Innovation Fellows brought some of these ideas about 5 years ago to the Census Bureau, that you needed to bring all these different stakeholders, public, private, civic, local community together in especially at the time when digital sort of is changing so many things. So I'm interested in what you're saying and whether or not some of these ideas might potentially be brought into what we're doing with the Open Innovation Lab. It's called COIL at the Census Bureau. And we're doing it in the form of 12-week sprints where you bring the stakeholders together and you iterate. So I just would like some reaction. I'll actually give the 3 topics that we're leading the sprints on. Small, medium enterprise financing, community asset mapping, geospatial community asset mapping, and then the third one is impact tracking for federal funds.
Yes, well, I'm certainly happy to, in a different session, share with you in more detail the method, I guess, the method we used for the Hartford Lab and what we learned from that, and how we would refine some of the tools that we used. But I think the thing that they told us in our debriefs is that we gave them a common language to use, because in the case of the Hartford, they had people from regulatory affairs, they had underwriters, they had people from finance, they had people from, the usual cross-disciplinary, and they don't speak the same language and they don't follow the same processes. Same with Nike. You can imagine how different it is to deal with, biohazards with recycled, t-shirts and then manufacturing and all this stuff. So having a common way of working and some common vocabulary to use and some prompts that cause the team to ask questions together and to answer them, they said was helpful. Happy to share that with you, and frankly, eager to find further opportunities to learn, whether these things are helpful or what's missing or how they could be refined.
Very good. Excellent. And Malin, I'll make sure that I do a very intentional connection between you and Jon after the call. And Jade, I'm going to call on you next. So thanks for having your hand up. I just want to ask Jon, your workshop that you're suggesting, it would seem to me that another organization that could use your stakeholder workshop right now is the PGA.
Well, Kevin, I'm on the board of the LPGA. And,
yes.
And we've been going through scenario planning ourselves.
I bet.
We're kind of digesting the news of the other day, as you can imagine. So, yeah. No, I think there's a lot of learning in that PGA one for sure, right? Around your values and around your business model and your stakeholders. And I think this is far from over from the standpoint of stakeholder management and whether or not, you've got stakeholders aligned and whether you care about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that a lot of people are kind of describing it as being a fait accompli, and all they really, brought to the public, which people don't, is it's a memorandum of understanding. It's not actually in any way, shape, or form fully baked. So, there's a lot of opportunity to still shape it, right?
Yeah.
So good luck with making it right for the LPGA, Jon. All right.
Thank you. Hi, Jade.
Hi, Jade. Jump in.
Hi. Well, Jon, it's so nice to see you and be here with you after so many years. And Kevin, thank you for inviting me to this. As you know, Jon, stakeholder management and bringing together diverse thinking is something that I've been passionate about for decades, starting with your sponsorship of innovation discovery. And so I'm so thrilled to see this formalized at Yale. I'm particularly interested in the case studies, that chart you had of all the companies that are interested. And I was wondering, of the 3 categories of companies that would benefit from this: startups, spin-offs, and companies that are going through transformation, which, as you said, is pretty much everyone.
Yeah.
Which ones are gravitating towards this the most in the early days of this thinking?
They have different needs. I would say startups, by and large, they're fascinated with this idea of codifying for the first time. They're like, who are we? How do we work here? And I find that some of them say, we've done that. And you say, well, what did you do? And they, we got in a room and wrote stuff down and then we published them. What else did you do? Well, nothing. Well, they're like, well, everyone loves our mission statement. They're all inspired. And I said, well, here's what others do. And you may find yourself wanting to do it or having to do it, like hiring criteria. And they're starting, wow, that's interesting. And so there's a hunger for that playbook. It's not novel, I'd say. Certainly, you could probably buy books that do that. But the fact that it comes up all the time, like for startups. In fact, Ken Chenault, who in his retirement is, among other things, chairman of General Catalyst, the VC firm, and he wants us to stand up a workshop or a program for founders of new companies and to take them through. Because a lot of them think these are big company things you do later, but Ken, having been on the board of Facebook, strongly believes you do now when there's 5 of you, when there's 15 of you. You don't do it later. That's when you have the problems you can't so easily fix or ever fix. And so he's sponsoring this piece of work around founders. The other ones kind of then vary. I think the ones that are most interesting to us is value creation, is this innovation piece. And they look at the Nike example, the Amex example, and other examples that we're documenting in case studies. And they're like, how do you do that? Because it's the simultaneous value that it's created that seems like almost like magic to them. I'll give you another example in our case line, our case study pipeline is now finished, is the European headquartered company Enel, which is a massive energy company headquartered in Italy, but they're beyond Europe as an energy company. They do energy generation and distribution. Talk to the CEO, Francesco Starace, who's been deposed by the new Italian government. But anyway, he talked about impaired balance sheet, massive write-offs of obsolete technology, terrible debt structures, financial crises. This is insane. He became CEO. He said, we can't do these 10-year power plant projects anymore. They got to be done in 3 years or less. Number two, we're constantly at war, sometimes literally with communities, because they don't want our power plants in their communities, even if we have the permits. So if they don't want us there after we make our case repeatedly, we're not going to put our power plant there. So he put two constraints on the entire company. And at like minute 42 in this interview, he said, so, so what happened? What happened? And he says, well, we had to create completely new thinking about power plants in 3 years. And we had to have a lot more optionality, because if the community doesn't want us, we've got to have a lot of proposals, not just a few. And way into the interview, he said, as a result, we're becoming a 100% renewable energy company. And you're like, and the stock price, by the way, has gone up like some tremendous amount. Like, Mr. Starace, you buried the lead. And by the way, you didn't say the word climate change, sustainability, moral imperative, planet on fire, until now. And he goes, well, those frankly weren't our motivations. They were, balance sheet impairment and I love that example, because most CEOs can relate to that, right? I think more so than the moral imperative to embrace something.
Yeah.
And so that in that case, it was trying to understand these seemingly unrelated problems, just normal business problems like debt, and see them not as isolated issues, but bringing them together. And then, of course, in his case, it turned out to be a massive culture change that was required. I mean, in the end, it was a culture change thing that allowed this nice, all the lines to go up like that. And so on, CVS Health, Karen Lynch, massive transformation from competing with, Walgreens and even Walmart to being a health provider. And the stakeholders are completely different. The financials are different. The brand permission is different. The employee value proposition is different. The regulatory environment is different. So a lot of CEOs can relate to that repositioning of a company changes so many things simultaneously. And they like the idea that we have an approach in concept to bring that together. So it's not like this transformation agenda that's sort of unrelated.
Yeah, that's such powerful examples. And it's interesting because culture change and shift oftentimes is isolated as another vertical in the company as well, right? So how do you bring all of that together? But on your comments about startups, I work very closely with many startups right now. I mentor at the NYU's Accelerator Lab, and I'm a founder myself. And I would love to explore with you further, how we work with them, because while many in retrospect will say, I wish I would have focused on that in the early days, it's very hard to get their attention on things like this. So it would be wonderful to brainstorm with you on that.
Yeah, I'd very much welcome that, Jade. I mean, Ken has the luxury of kind of ordering them to do this, because if you want funding from General Catalyst, you will go to this like boot camp thing. And also they admire him because he's Ken Chenault, right? And American Express and all that stuff. But a lot of them, as you say, they have other crushing priorities. And this seems to be like, take your medicine or something. Part of our response to that is trying to curate this experience, including some CEOs they want to be like. I don't mean Ken, right? I mean, like Neil Blumenthal of Warby Parker and a few others, where they can. It's more like I can be that within 7 years, right? Or not 35 years. That's, you know, I can have a business that is growing and is profitable and is admired, and I could be rich and I could be admired and, you know, all that stuff. How do you do that? And if they hear enough testimony from those CEOs,
Yeah.
to say, you think this is not something important, I'm telling you it is important. It's not the only thing, but you don't want to leave that to year 10. You want to do that now. And you don't have to spend your whole life doing it, but you can do it the following ways.
Yeah.
I'll just say that the here in the Research Triangle area, when you look at the UNC, Duke, and NC State entrepreneurship programs, at least 50% of the plans that are coming forward are for-purpose, for-profit plans. And so and they're not B Corps, and they're not necessarily, they're just saying, we have a reason for existing, here's what it is, right? So they're at least have some notionality of, you know, purpose as an upfront characteristic of why they're doing what they're doing. Interesting.
Yeah, but it's brilliant in the early days to focus on where the money is, like you were saying. You know, we won't fund you with, but yeah, but it needs to go beyond that.
Yeah. Ben, you had your comments in chat, and we would welcome your thinking. We can't hear you, Ben. You're on mute, my friend. No. Something's amiss.
I see your question in the
Yeah,
chat.
so we're going to respond to your chat question, and if you get your mic going, go for it. John?
Yeah, how do you get the historical dimension? Yeah, okay. So in the case of Nike and Hartford, it came through putting them on the same team and having a dialogue around, you know, the shared goal. But the goal wasn't, the shared goal was reflective of the thing they cared about. So in the case of the Hartford, you had people who understood the regulators. And so they said, they weren't just sitting in the room with their arms folded saying, that will never work, that will never work. They were in the room trying to solve, saying, listen, you may not think that the regulator would go for that, but if you did it this way, they would be very supportive of it. In the case of Nike, they actually did a documentary as this shoe was being developed. They went to either Vietnam or Bangladesh, where they had Nike manufacturers trying out this shoe for the first time, and they had on film these manufacturers saying, you know, these shoes are made out of leftover shoes, right? So every sole that comes out has all these different colors in it and threads sticking out and stuff. And I saw on this documentary they made, the manufacturer saying, Nike will never accept this shoe because every shoe is different. They'll fire us as suppliers. This is impossible. This is not what Nike wants. And they said, we're from Nike. You know, we're telling you this is the new standard of quality because of the shoe. And they walked away from the camera thinking they were getting in trouble or something. So the answer was to bring them into the process. You know, this is not what Nike normally does, to say, help us. We need you to understand what we're trying to do. We need your help here. I'll give you another example that they showed me. Obviously every Nike shoe needs to have a swoosh on it. The typical way they do that is they cut the swoosh out of a different material, then they stitch it on or glue it on. And they were racking their brains how to do that in a more low carbon way. And they were coming with all kinds of ideas. And one day they asked the manufacturer, since they were there, they didn't ask the manufacturer, how would you put the swoosh on? They asked the manufacturer, what is the lowest cost, the easiest way to, you know, do something? Well, and the manufacturer says, embroidery. And they were like, embroidery is low cost? Yes, you know, and it's this and that. And they embroider, if you look at the Space Hippie shoe, the swoosh is embroidered into the shoe. And the design team said they never would have come up with that. You know? So this is in a way kind of common sense, you know, bring in the team, invite them to help solve. But again, they needed a few things to help them have that common process, common language that seemed to help.
That's great. Ben, you're commenting. We can't hear you, so you can put your thoughts into chat. Jon, a follow up in kind of the general space that you're exploring. The other side that this has been, looked at is freedom to operate. Permission to operate would be another, view of this. The work that was done by Pfeffer and Solancic in the book, The External Control of Organizations. So to what degree is Yale and your, colleague, to what degree are you looking at those issues as also a positive way of looking at, hey, we're going to have the best ability to move forward and succeed and accomplish our mission if we think about all these stakeholders and they're part of our thinking, and therefore, we're going to have more, permission to operate.
Yeah, CEOs like the ones you would expect to hear from are eloquent about that, and they take it almost as a given that you have to continue to earn that license to operate or social license to operate. Otherwise, it can be revoked. Others understand that, and they agree. I guess where it rears its head in concrete ways is regulation. That if you don't earn your license to operate by proactively taking care of things like your externalities, then some societies will revoke your license. In other words, they'll regulate. They will compel you to address certain things through taxation, through regulation, through requirements. And of course, by and large, CEOs have an allergic reaction to regulation. So if you don't want to be regulated, then don't give society a reason to have to regulate you, either because you're polluting or you're not stepping up to certain issues. Now, the economists would call that enlightened stakeholder capitalism. But it seems to be taking hold now, especially if you talk the language of externalities and regulation.
Okay, I suspected that was the case, but I just wanted current context for what you were exploring. There are some other people that know your background. Mike, are you with us at Carnegie? I can't see if you're. Mike, you're in a car. Good. He's making himself available in his.
So my only question really is about going a little deeper on the data questions, and particularly you commented on the need to make data systems that align with the values. And I've just not seen many examples. So if there are examples of people doing new ways of building systems for managing customer data in particular in ways that make it transparent to the customer that they're being treated with respect and their data is being used in the way they would want it used, I'd be all ears. It's something I'm spending a lot of time on: data trusts, data unions, a lot of different terms for this new way of doing the architecture. Our friend Irving Vladosky-Berger at MIT is doing a lot with Sandy Pentland in this regard.
Yes, well, this is of course an important and different dimension of data, Mike. And I'm going to put in chat. So in my other, the other thing I spend time on is this organization that was formed by Ken Chenault and Sam Palmisano back in 2020 called the Data and Trust Alliance, which is a consortium of 25 mostly big brand kind of companies about responsible AI, data and AI practice. And this is what we're spending gobs of time on, Mike, is around responsibility in data algorithms and AI. Our current project is to establish by these companies and to adopt data provenance standards, which don't exist today, or data quality standards. But in that whole fuzzball of data quality, as you know, there were so many potential dimensions of data quality, which is vital for AI trustworthiness and transparency, that we've targeted a subset of data quality attributes we're calling data provenance. So that work is underway here, and it's kind of like a nutrition label, but more than that, so that people understand what data sets, the origin of the data, the rights associated with data, when was it collected or synthesized, et cetera. And the fact that the companies themselves don't have even intra-company standards is quite, quite concerning. So we're trying to solve that for this consortium of businesses, and hopefully their market power in Walmart, CVS Health, General Motors, Starbucks, Nike, UPS, IBM, Meta, and others, their market power will begin to address that. So that's a somewhat different dimension of stakeholder capitalism. Of course, data and consumers, very, very important.
And I'll just remind everyone that we had Sam Palmisano as a guest, right, for PCI. So we have a recording that can give you a lot of detail about that data trust work that Jon's helping lead. So, listen to that from our archive recordings if you want more information about it. Jon, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I don't see any other questions, and I'm going to ask you to just give us some closing comments and closing invitations to collaborate and asks, because you'd made one ask, right? Connect you to other CEOs who would participate in your research, especially outside the United States. So we welcome your thoughts and requests.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks for this opportunity. Yeah, that I just want to reiterate that one. We continue to interview leaders. It could be for not-for-profit. I interviewed the head of the ASPCA not long ago. It could be large companies, smaller companies outside the U.S. I would say we would particularly value smaller enterprises and non-U.S. enterprises, but they all help. So if you have those, it's 1 hour, Chatham House rules, and et cetera. So thank you for that. And as we heard already, if you were eager to do more labs, trying out some of these ideas about multi-stakeholder design or multi-stakeholder value creation. And so if you have some thoughts about that, I'll be happy to talk about potentially collaborating on one of those in the service of learning. And that's about it.
Very good. Well, we greatly appreciate you spending time with us on a Sunday, and we wish you all the best as you do this work. It is absolutely critical that we understand, right, this broader set of constituents. So we wish you all the best, and I'm sure you will be hearing from some of the people who are on the call today. Folks, thanks for being with us this Sunday, and in everything you do, be intentional. We'll talk again in a couple of weeks. Cheers. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you, Jon.